The laughter faded as the German soldiers boarded the transport ships. Rumors had spread through the Wehrmacht ranks that American captivity meant hard labor in primitive conditions, possibly even torture. America, nein bitte, many had pleaded upon capture in North Africa and Europe. Yet within months, thousands of these same men would write letters home describing their American imprisonment with phrases like paradisisch, paradisiacal, and besser als zu Hause, better than home. The story of German prisoners of war in Texas during World War II reveals one of history's most remarkable ironies. Enemy soldiers who feared American captivity would ultimately find themselves living in conditions superior to those of many American citizens. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The dawn of May 1943 saw the arrival of the first major contingent of German prisoners at the port of Galveston, Texas. As they disembarked under the watchful eyes of American guards, the Germans squinted in the unfamiliar intensity of the Texas sun. Many wore the remnants of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps uniforms, designed for desert warfare, but now worn thin from months of battle and capture. Military police with Thompson submachine guns stood at attention, but there was little need for such security measures. These men, once part of Hitler's vaunted war machine, were exhausted, disoriented, and thousands of miles from home. Captain Heinrich Müller, a 31-year-old officer captured near Tunis, later recalled, "We expected to be paraded through the streets, to be humiliated as propaganda displays of American victory. Instead, we were quietly loaded onto trains headed inland. The guards were professional, not cruel. This was our first surprise." The journey from Galveston to the interior of Texas took the prisoners through landscapes utterly foreign to European eyes, endless horizons, sprawling ranches, and towns that seemed to appear from nowhere in the vast emptiness. By mid-1943, the United States faced an unexpected logistical challenge. Military successes in North Africa and Italy had yielded tens of thousands of Axis prisoners, far exceeding initial planning estimates. The Geneva Convention, which America was determined to honor despite the brutal nature of the war, required humane treatment of prisoners. Housing them in Europe was impractical due to overcrowding and the proximity to the front lines. The solution was both pragmatic and ambitious: construct a network of prisoner-of-war camps across America, with Texas, due to its size, climate, and agricultural needs, designated to receive over 50,000 prisoners, the largest concentration in any American state. The strategic calculus behind this decision was multifaceted. First, America's heartland provided natural security. Escape would be futile with thousands of miles separating prisoners from any Axis territory. Second, the agricultural regions of Texas were suffering severe labor shortages as American men joined the military. Third, the climate of Texas, while harsh, was conducive to year-round work programs that would keep prisoners occupied and productive. Finally, the vast open spaces allowed for camps to be constructed quickly and economically. The plan was not without controversy. Across Texas, communities initially reacted with alarm to the prospect of Nazis being housed in their vicinity. The Houston Chronicle ran alarming headlines about Hitler's soldiers coming to Texas soil, while local officials in towns like Huntsville, Hearne, and Brady expressed concerns about security, escape attempts, and Nazi indoctrination spreading to the local population. These fears were not entirely unfounded. The German military's reputation for discipline and fanaticism had been established through years of successful blitzkrieg across Europe. What few Texans or prisoners realized was that they were about to become participants in one of the war's most unusual social experiments. Between 1943 and 1946, more than 50,000 German prisoners would be housed in 70 different facilities across Texas, from major base camps holding 3,000, 4,000 men to smaller satellite camps with just a few hundred prisoners assigned to specific agricultural projects. The program would challenge preconceptions on both sides and create human connections that defied the hatreds cultivated by war propaganda. Camp Hearn, located in east-central Texas, became one of the first major POW installations. Constructed in just months during late 1942, it was designed to hold approximately 3,000 prisoners. The layout followed military efficiency, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by two barbed wire fences with guard towers positioned at regular intervals. Captain Robert Kennedy, the camp's first commander, had received specific instructions from the War Department. These men are to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They are soldiers, not criminals, but they are also the enemy. Firm discipline without unnecessary harshness is the standard. When the first German prisoners arrived at Camp Hearn in the spring of 1943, many were still dressed in their desert uniforms from the North African campaign. Hauptmann Friedrich Gottlob, a tank commander captured near Kasserine Pass, described his arrival. "We expected primitive conditions, perhaps tents in the desert. What we found were proper wooden buildings with real beds. There was running water, showers, and a mess hall. Some men became emotional at the sight of it. After months of combat and the misery of transport ships, it seemed almost luxurious." The living conditions in Texas POW camps were regulated by international law, specifically the Geneva Convention of 1929. These regulations required housing comparable to what the detaining power provided its own troops in training facilities. In practice, this meant that German POWs lived in standard military barracks with proper heating, plumbing, and mess facilities. Each prisoner received a bed, footlocker, and access to showers and latrines. The comparison to American training facilities was not merely theoretical. Many POW camps had been constructed as Army training centers before being converted to hold prisoners. What truly astonished many prisoners, however, was the food. Under Geneva Convention requirements, POWs were to receive rations identical to those of American garrison troops. In the resource-rich United States, this meant a caloric intake often exceeding what German soldiers had received even before their capture. Breakfast typically included eggs, milk, cereal, and bread. Lunch and dinner featured meat, vegetables, desserts, and coffee. For men who had experienced increasingly severe rationing in Germany and near-starvation conditions during the North African campaign, this abundance was shocking. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Wagner, a non-commissioned officer captured in Sicily, wrote in his diary, "The first morning, they served us eggs with bacon, white bread with real butter, and coffee with sugar and milk. We thought it was a special welcome meal. Then the same quality came the next day and the next. Some comrades believe it is a propaganda trick that will soon end. Others worry about our families in Germany who surely have far less." This disparity created complex emotions among the prisoners. While their physical comfort improved dramatically in Texas, news from home brought reports of increasing deprivation as Allied bombing devastated German cities. Letters from families described food shortages, fuel rationing, and the constant fear of air raids. The psychological burden of being well fed while loved ones suffered weighed heavily on many prisoners. Some even attempted to send portions of their Red Cross packages back to Germany, though wartime regulations prevented this. The daily routine in Texas POW camps followed military precision. Reveille sounded at 600 hours, followed by breakfast and roll call. The majority of the day was dedicated to work assignments, with a break for lunch. Evening hours after the final roll call belonged to the prisoners for recreation, education, or personal time. Lights out came at 2200 hours. This structured existence provided a sense of normalcy that many prisoners found stabilizing after the chaos of combat and capture. Work became the defining element of the POW experience in Texas. The Geneva Convention permitted detaining powers to employ prisoners, except officers, who could not be compelled to work, in various non-military capacities. With America's wartime economy facing severe labor shortages, the POW workforce became an unexpected economic asset. Private contractors, particularly farmers and agricultural processors, could hire prisoner labor through the War Department. The standard rate was $0.80 per day per prisoner, of which the prisoner received $0.80 in scrip, camp currency, to use at the post exchange. The remaining funds went to the U.S. government to offset the costs of maintaining the POW program. By the summer of 1943, German prisoners were working throughout rural Texas. They harvested cotton, rice, and citrus fruits. They worked in canneries, lumber mills, and food processing plants. For farmers facing the prospect of crops rotting in the fields due to labor shortages, the prisoner workforce was salvation. For many prisoners, the work, though sometimes challenging in the Texas heat, provided purpose and a respite from the monotony of camp life. Hans Geller, a 23-year-old private from Munich, worked on a cotton farm near Camp Swift. In letters preserved in the National Archives, he wrote, "We leave camp at sunrise in trucks. The Texas landscape is so vast it seems unreal, like an ocean of land. The farmer who supervises us doesn't speak German, but he demonstrates what needs to be done. My hands were soft when I arrived. Now they are calloused like a true farmer's. Sometimes I think I have learned more about agriculture here than I would have in years of school in Germany." The interaction between German prisoners and Texas civilians created a complex dynamic. Initial apprehension on both sides gradually evolved into pragmatic cooperation and, in some cases, genuine human connection. Farm families who employed POW labor often provided additional food beyond military rations. Conversations across language barriers began haltingly but improved over time. Children were particularly effective at bridging divides, their natural curiosity uncomplicated by adult prejudices. Not all interactions were positive, however. In some communities, the sight of German prisoners shopping in local stores under guard or attending church services provoked resentment, particularly among families with sons fighting overseas. The War Department received complaints about coddling the enemy when newspapers published photos of prisoners enjoying recreational activities. Some Texans struggled to reconcile the humanity of the individual Germans they encountered with the abstract enemy portrayed in war propaganda. By late 1943, the prisoners themselves had created remarkably organized internal communities within the Texas camps. The War Department policy of separating prisoners based on rank and political orientation proved effective in maintaining order. German military discipline remained largely intact, with senior non-commissioned officers and officers, when present, maintaining authority over their fellow prisoners with the approval of American commanders. The internal organization of the camps followed German military structure, with barracks organized into companies and battalions. This arrangement satisfied both the prisoners' need for familiar hierarchy and the American administrators' preference for orderly management. Each barracks typically elected a spokesman who represented prisoner concerns to the camp authorities. This system generally functioned smoothly, with grievances addressed through established channels rather than through confrontation. Camp economies emerged as prisoners received work payment in camp scrip. The post exchanges stocked tobacco, personal items, writing materials, and additional food. Some industrious prisoners established internal businesses, barbershops, tailoring services, watch repair, and even restaurants using ingredients purchased from the post-exchange to supplement standard meals. Artistic prisoners created paintings, sculptures, and crafts that they traded or sold to guards and visitors. The cultural life that blossomed in Texas POW camps defied outside expectations. Prisoners formed orchestras, theater groups, and sports teams. They established educational programs teaching languages, mathematics, engineering, and other subjects. Camp Hearn became known for its orchestra. which performed German classical music on Sunday afternoons, sometimes with American officers and their families in attendance. At Camp Swift, prisoners constructed an outdoor theater where they performed plays ranging from light comedies to serious dramas. Gefreiter Werner Kuntz, a talented violinist who had played with the Munich Philharmonic before the war, led the Camp Herne Orchestra. In a 1944 letter to his parents, he wrote, "We performed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony last week. The acoustics in our mess hall are surprisingly good. For 2 hours, we were not prisoners, but musicians again. Even some of the American guards stayed to listen." Music speaks when words cannot. The athletic competitions organized by prisoners attracted particular attention. Soccer emerged as the favored sport, with teams from different companies or barracks competing in regular tournaments. Boxing matches, tennis competitions, and even swimming meets, in camps with pools or nearby natural swimming areas, provided both recreation and a healthy outlet for competitive energy. American guards sometimes participated in friendly matches, creating brief moments when the divisions of war seemed to fade. Religious life in the camps reflected the predominantly Christian background of both prisoners and captors. Protestant and Catholic services were conducted regularly, often by imprisoned German military chaplains or, when necessary, by American clergy. The shared religious traditions created unexpected bridges between enemies. Father Ludwig Schumacher, a Catholic priest and military chaplain captured in North Africa, held Christmas services in 1943 at Camp Mexia that were attended by both German prisoners and American personnel. The intellectual life in Texas POW camps was surprisingly vibrant. Many camps established libraries containing thousands of volumes, including German-language books provided by the YMCA and other international organizations. Camp newspapers, written and printed by prisoners, circulated with American approval, though subject to censorship. Educational courses ranged from practical skills like English language instruction to academic subjects including engineering, mathematics, and literature. Dr. Otto Engelhardt, a professor of literature at the University of Leipzig before being drafted into the Wehrmacht, established a comprehensive educational program at Camp Herne that enrolled over 800 prisoners. "We have created a university behind barbed wire," he wrote in the camp newspaper. "The mind cannot be imprisoned even when the body is confined. Some of our students are making more progress here than they might have in peacetime, perhaps because education offers escape from our circumstances." The Nazi regime cast a long shadow even into the Texas camps. German prisoners had been shaped by years of National Socialist education and propaganda. Many remained committed to the Nazi cause, while others had harbored private doubts even before capture. The American authorities attempted to separate known Nazi Party members and ardent supporters from the general prisoner population, creating special facilities for the most fanatical adherents. However, in most camps, the prisoner population included the full spectrum of political beliefs. This internal political divide sometimes created tension and even violence within the camps. Prisoners suspected of anti-Nazi sentiments or excessive fraternization with Americans faced ostracism or threats from Nazi loyalists. In several documented cases across the Texas camp system, prisoners deemed traitors were assaulted or even murdered by fellow captives. The American authorities responded by further segregating prisoners based on political orientation and increasing surveillance of internal camp activities. Karl Binder, a private who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht from his university studies, described the political pressure. "Those who displayed the strongest Nazi convictions controlled much of the social life in our compound. They organized discussion groups that were really indoctrination sessions. If you didn't attend or express doubts about final victory, you were labeled a traitor. Men would wake to find a small drawing of a coffin on their footlocker, a warning." The Americans didn't fully understand these dynamics at first. The American military government undertook a more systematic approach to prisoner re-education beginning in late 1944. Rather than direct confrontation with Nazi ideology, which might trigger resistance, The program exposed prisoners to objective information about world events, democratic principles, and American society. Special camp newspapers presented unaltered news of the war, including German defeats. Film screenings, library materials, and educational courses subtly introduced democratic concepts. Captain Walter Rapp, who helped develop the re-education program, explained its philosophy. We don't tell them what to think. We simply provide factual information and let them draw their own conclusions. As the truth about Nazi Germany becomes impossible to deny, many are receptive to alternative perspectives. Our approach is education, not indoctrination, the very opposite of the system they came from. By early 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. The news reached Texas camps through officially approved newspapers, radio broadcasts, and letters from home that passed through censorship. The psychological impact on prisoners varied dramatically. Some remained convinced that secret German weapons would reverse the situation. Others fell into depression as they recognized the likelihood of Germany's defeat. Many began to contemplate the uncertain future that awaited them after the war in a destroyed homeland. Unteroffizier Heinrich Müller, who had served in Russia before being captured in Italy, described the changing mood. When we arrived in 1943, most believed Germany would still win. We discussed when we would return to service, not if. By mid-1944, after the invasion of France, the conversations changed. Men began to learn trades, improve their English, prepare for a different future. The wall map in our barracks, where we tracked the front lines with pins, told the story none of us wanted to admit. As the war in Europe approached its conclusion, the War Department expanded its work programs for German POWs. By early 1945, more than 300,000 acres of Texas agricultural land were being cultivated with prisoner labor. German engineers helped construct flood control projects. Prisoners with forestry experience worked in East Texas lumber operations. The economic impact was significant. A 1945 report by the Texas Agricultural Extension Service estimated that POW labor had saved crops valued at over $20 million in the previous year alone. Herman Baumann, who worked on a rice farm near Camp Huntsville, reflected on this contribution. It is strange to think that we, as enemy soldiers, helped feed America during the war. The farmer who employs us says that without our work, his crop would rot in the fields. His sons are fighting in Europe, perhaps against our comrades. Yet here, we work together to harvest the rice. War creates such contradictions. The most unexpected aspect of the Texas POW experience was the degree of integration into local communities that developed over time. Though always under guard, prisoners working on farms often ate meals with farm families. They attended local church services, participated in community events under supervision, and in some cases formed genuine friendships with their American employers. These human connections contradicted the dehumanizing rhetoric of wartime propaganda. Elizabeth Kerner, who owned a peach orchard near Fredericksburg where prisoners worked, later recalled, "At first, I was terrified to have German soldiers on my property. My own brother was fighting in Europe, but then you realize they're just young men, someone's sons and brothers. One of them, a boy named Stefan, repaired our tractor when no one else could figure out what was wrong with it. Another taught my children German folk songs. How can you maintain hatred face to face?" This gradual humanization worked in both directions. Many prisoners arrived with stereotypical views of Americans shaped by Nazi propaganda, expecting to find a decadent, undisciplined society. The reality of America's industrial might, agricultural abundance, and ethnic diversity challenged these preconceptions. Particularly impactful was the experience of witnessing African American soldiers serving as guards, a direct contradiction to Nazi racial ideology. The intersection of German POWs with America's racial segregation created complex situations. African American guards supervising white German prisoners in the segregated South inverted the racial hierarchy that both Jim Crow America and Nazi Germany enforced. Some German prisoners indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology initially refused to take orders from black guards. The Army's response was unequivocal. Prisoners who displayed such insubordination faced disciplinary action, including solitary confinement. Sergeant William Henderson, an African-American guard at Camp Swift, described these interactions. Some of them Nazis wouldn't look me in the eye at first, wouldn't follow orders. That changed quick when they realized I controlled when they ate and when they had privileges. After a while, most treated me with the same respect as any other guard. A few even admitted they'd been wrong about their racial theories after seeing black soldiers and officers in the U.S. Army. Texas communities adjacent to POW camps gradually developed more nuanced views of their involuntary German neighbors. Local newspapers that had initially published alarming headlines about Nazis next door began featuring human interest stories about prisoner art exhibitions, musical performances, and work contributions. Church congregations that had hesitated to welcome prisoners began inviting them to services, finding common ground in shared faith traditions. The Tyler Morning Telegraph captured this evolution in a December 1944 editorial. "We must remember that not every German soldier is a Nazi, just as not every American embraces all our government's policies. The prisoners working on Smith County farms have proven themselves to be, for the most part, respectful, hard-working men caught in a war not of their making. While we cannot forget they served in the enemy's army, neither can we deny their humanity." As 1945 progressed and victory in Europe approached, conditions in the camps evolved. Security remained strict. Attempted escapes, though rare, were treated with appropriate seriousness. However, certain restrictions relaxed as the threat diminished. More prisoners received town visit privileges under guard. Cultural exchanges with local communities increased. The focus shifted increasingly toward preparing prisoners for eventual repatriation to a defeated Germany. May 8, 1945, VE Day, marked a profound turning point for the POW camps. The news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached Texas camps through official announcements. The prisoners' reactions ranged from relief that the killing had ended to despair over their nation's defeat. Many worried about family members in cities devastated by bombing. With the European conflict concluded, the legal basis for holding prisoners technically ended, though practical considerations would delay repatriation. Corporal Fritz Weber, held at Camp Brady, described VE Day in his diary. "The Americans announced Germany's surrender over the camp loudspeaker this morning. No one spoke during lunch. Some men wept quietly. Others stared blankly at their food. We had known this was coming for months, yet the reality is still a shock." Captain Miller, the American officer, was respectful, no celebrations or taunting. He simply said they would begin preparations for our eventual return home, though he warned it would take time. Tonight, the question on everyone's mind is, what kind of Germany will we return to? The transformation of Germany from enemy to potential ally in the emerging Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union accelerated changes in the POW program. Re-education efforts intensified, now explicitly promoting democratic values and warning about Soviet expansionism. Selected prisoners received specialized training in civil administration, infrastructure rebuilding, and democratic governance, preparation for roles they might play in reconstructing Germany. Life in Texas camps during this transitional period became increasingly focused on skill development and education. Vocational programs expanded, offering training in construction trades, mechanics, electronics, and other practical skills needed for rebuilding a shattered Europe. University-level courses established formal relationships with American educational institutions, allowing prisoners to earn credits that might transfer to German universities after repatriation. The War Department, recognizing the potential influence these men might have in post-war Germany, became more deliberate about exposing them to positive aspects of American society. Supervised visits to farms, factories, schools, and civic institutions were arranged. Guest speakers from various professions discussed the American system of government, economic organization, and social structures. These experiences would shape how former prisoners portrayed America to their countrymen after returning home. As 1945 drew to a close, the process of repatriation began. Priority went to prisoners with specialized skills needed for European reconstruction, those with compassionate grounds such as family hardships, and those deemed most thoroughly denazified. The logistics were complex: transportation constraints, the need to coordinate with occupation authorities, and screening procedures to prevent the return of committed Nazis all slowed the process. For prisoners who had spent years in Texas, departure evoked mixed emotions. They eagerly anticipated reunion with families, but dreaded what they might find in war-ravaged Germany. Many had formed unexpected connections in Texas with employers, local families, even guards. These relationships culminated in farewell gatherings that would have seemed inconceivable when the prisoners first arrived. Eric Kaminsky, who had worked on a cattle ranch near Camp Hearn for over 2 years, described his departure. The rancher's family brought gifts, clothes, food, even tools they thought might be useful in Germany. Mrs. Hartman was crying. Their son is still serving in the occupation forces in Germany. They made me promise to look him up when I return. 2 years ago, I was their enemy. Today, they embrace me like family. This is something I never expected from Captivity. As trains carried German prisoners from Texas camps to East Coast ports throughout 1946, they left behind more than empty barracks. Their labor had contributed significantly to Texas agriculture during crucial wartime shortages. Their artwork adorned churches, public buildings, and private homes throughout the state. They had participated in a remarkable, if unintended, cultural exchange that challenged preconceptions on both sides of the barbed wire. What no one could fully appreciate at the time was that the Texas POW experience would have far-reaching implications for post-war German-American relations. The hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who experienced American captivity, particularly the relatively humane conditions of the Texas camps, would return to Germany with first-hand knowledge that contradicted years of Nazi propaganda about the United States. Many would become informal ambassadors for American values and practices during Germany's crucial Reconstruction period. As the last German POWs departed Texas in 1946, the physical infrastructure of the camps was rapidly repurposed or dismantled. Camp Hearn became part of a municipal airport. Camp Swift was partially incorporated into the University of Texas. Camp Huntsville's facilities were absorbed by the Texas prison system. Within a few years, little visible evidence remained of this massive wartime program. The human connections, however, proved more durable. The repatriation process accelerated throughout 1946, with ships departing regularly from East Coast ports, carrying former prisoners back to Europe. The journey home reversed the path taken years earlier, but under dramatically different circumstances. Rather than defeated soldiers being transported to an uncertain captivity, they were now returning to a homeland they barely recognized. Germany divided into occupation zones, major cities reduced to rubble, and an uncertain future under Allied administration. For many Texas camp veterans, the shock of seeing their homeland's devastation firsthand exceeded even their worst expectations. Wilhelm Hoffmann, formerly held at Camp Swift, described his return to Hamburg. The train from Bremerhaven passed through landscapes I could not recognize. Then we entered Hamburg, or what remained of it. Entire neighborhoods simply gone, replaced by mountains of broken bricks. The station where my father had once worked was a skeleton of twisted metal. I sat on my suitcase and wept, not just for the destruction, but for the strange feeling that Texas had become more familiar to me than my own hometown. The economic conditions awaiting returnees were dire. Currency had little value, basic goods were scarce, and industrial production had collapsed. Housing was critically inadequate, with millions of Germans living in damaged buildings or temporary shelters. Food shortages approached famine conditions in some areas, with average daily caloric intake falling below 1,200 calories. less than half what prisoners had received in Texas camps. Many returnees found themselves in the disorienting position of having been better fed in enemy captivity than their families were in peacetime Germany. Reunion with family members, though joyful, often came with complications. Wives and children had adapted to the prisoners' absence, developing independence and resilience through necessity. Political views had sometimes diverged, particularly as Germans came to terms with the full revelations of Nazi atrocities. Years of separation had created emotional distance that took time to bridge. In many cases, children barely recognized fathers who had left when they were infants. Franz Müller, who had spent 3 years at Camp Herren, wrote to his former American supervisor in 1947, "My son was 4 when I last saw him. Now he is 9 and regards me almost as a stranger. My wife managed our apartment building and dealt with the bombing raids alone. They survived on rations I would have considered starvation in Texas. When I described the camps, the food, the sports, the orchestra, they looked at me with disbelief." Some returnees have learned not to speak of America at all, as it sounds like fantasy, or worse, like boasting while others suffered. The post-war German economy's reconstruction, later called the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, drew upon the skills and experiences many prisoners had gained in Texas. Men who had worked on agricultural projects brought back knowledge of American farming techniques. Those who had received mechanical training found their skills in high demand as Germany rebuilt its industrial base. The practical education provided in camp programs, originally intended to keep prisoners occupied, became unexpectedly valuable in a nation rebuilding from scratch. Herbert Weber, who had learned electrical wiring while working on construction projects near Camp Swift, became part of the team reconstructing Frankfurt's power grid. "The Americans taught us their methods for efficiency, not expecting we would use this knowledge to rebuild Germany," he noted in a 1950 interview with a Frankfurt newspaper. "In the camps, we had access to technical manuals and training that prepared us for exactly the challenges we now face. Some of us even returned with handwritten notes and drawings from our work assignments." Beyond practical skills, former prisoners brought back first-hand experience with American democratic practices and institutions. In POW camps, prisoners had elected barracks representatives, participated in camp newspapers, and observed American civic processes. These experiences provided models for democratic participation at a time when Germany was establishing new political institutions. In some communities, former POWs became mayors, council members, or civil administrators, applying organizational skills honed in camp self-governance. The U.S. occupation authorities recognized this potential influence and established programs to maintain contact with former prisoners who showed democratic leanings. The Information Control Division tracked the activities of repatriated POWs and occasionally recruited them for positions in the new German media, education system, and civil service. These men, having lived in America and observed its society firsthand, were considered valuable allies in the cultural and political reorientation of Germany. Karl-Heinz Müller, who had edited a camp newspaper at Camp Herren, was recruited to work for Die Neue Zeitung, a newspaper established by American occupation authorities. "They approached me because I understood American journalistic practices and had demonstrated anti-Nazi views in the camp," he recalled. "My experience in Texas gave me credibility with both the Americans and with Germans who respected that I had served in the military but rejected Nazism." In the emerging Cold War context, former prisoners often became informal ambassadors for American culture and values. Those who had been held in Texas frequently contrasted their experiences with reports from compatriots who had been prisoners in Soviet captivity, where conditions were drastically harsher and mortality rates much higher. These personal testimonies contributed to West Germany's cultural and political alignment with the United States during this critical period. The Texas experience also influenced attitudes toward racial issues. German POWs had observed American racial segregation firsthand, often with surprise given their own country's racial ideology. Some prisoners had developed relationships with Mexican-American farm workers or had been guarded by African-American soldiers, interactions that challenged Nazi racial doctrines. Upon return to Germany, these experiences sometimes translated into more progressive racial attitudes during a period when Germany was re-evaluating its own disastrous experiment with racism. Johannes Bachmann, who worked alongside Mexican-American agricultural workers near Camp Kennedy, later became a schoolteacher in Bavaria. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The Nazi education had taught us that Slavs, Jews, and other races were inferior. In Texas, I worked with men of Mexican descent who showed me their family photos, shared their lunch, and taught me Spanish words. One was a mathematical genius who could calculate complicated measurements in his head. This experience made me question everything I had been taught about racial hierarchy." For Texas communities, the departure of the prisoners marked the end of a unique chapter in local history. Farmers who had come to rely on POW labor faced renewed workforce challenges. Cultural programs that had featured prisoner orchestras and theatrical groups ceased. Churches where German prisoners had attended services alongside American congregants returned to their pre-war routines. The economic impact was significant. A 1947 report estimated that POW labor had contributed the equivalent of $17 million, approximately $220 million in 2025 dollars, to the Texas economy during the program's existence. The physical infrastructure of the camps was rapidly repurposed. Camp Hearn's facilities were partially incorporated into a municipal airport. Camp Swift became home to part of the University of Texas system. Other camps were converted to civilian uses ranging from community colleges to agricultural research stations. By 1950, most visible evidence of the POW camps had disappeared from the Texas landscape, though administrative buildings, foundations, and occasional structures remained as the only physical testament to this massive wartime program. What endured longer than the physical structures were the human connections. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions as former prisoners maintained contact with Texas employers, guards, and families they had come to know. These personal relationships, formed across the divide of wartime enmity, represented a grassroots form of reconciliation that paralleled official diplomatic efforts to integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Martin Krause, who had worked on a cattle ranch near Camp Swift, corresponded with the rancher's family for over a decade. In 1960, when economic conditions in Germany had improved sufficiently to permit international travel, he returned to Texas as a tourist. The local newspaper covered the visit with the headline, "Former POW Returns as Friend." Photographs showed Krause embracing his former employer and riding horses with the rancher's grandchildren, a powerful visual symbol of reconciliation. Such visits became increasingly common throughout the 1960s as travel restrictions eased, and Germany's economic recovery enabled former prisoners to afford international travel. Organizations of former POWs arranged group tours to the sites of their captivity. Local historical societies in Texas communities began documenting the POW experience through oral histories, photographic exhibitions, and the preservation of artifacts from the camps. Not all memories were positive, of course. For some prisoners, captivity, however humane by wartime standards, remained a painful chapter they preferred not to revisit. Others had experienced the darker aspects of the POW system: political pressure from Nazi loyalists within the camps, the psychological strain of separation from families during Germany's darkest hours, or the minority of American personnel who had treated prisoners with unnecessary harshness. These mixed experiences were part of the complex legacy of the Texas POW program. The majority of former prisoners, however, expressed surprisingly positive recollections of their time in Texas. A survey conducted by German historians in the 1970s found that over 70% of former POWs held in the United States described their captivity experience as positive or mostly positive, with Texas camps receiving particularly favorable evaluations due to climate, work opportunities, and treatment by local populations. Werner Schmidt, who had been held at Camp Mexia, returned to Texas in 1975 for a reunion organized by the local historical society. In an interview with the Waco Tribune-Herald, he reflected, "For us, it was the irony of fate that our best years during that terrible time were spent behind barbed wire in Texas. While our cities were being bombed and our countrymen dying, we were playing soccer, performing concerts, and eating 3 full meals a day. It created a strange guilt that many of us carried for decades. Yet the unexpected kindness we experienced also gave us hope for Germany's future when we returned to ruins." The scholarly examination of the POW experience intensified during the 1970s and 1980s, as both German and American historians recognized its significance for understanding wartime enemy treatment, cultural exchange, and post-conflict reconciliation. Academic studies revealed the program's multiple dimensions as a pragmatic solution to wartime labor shortages, as a laboratory for re-education efforts, and as an unplanned exercise in cross-cultural understanding that contributed to post-war German-American relations. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a historian at Texas A&M University, became the leading academic authority on the Texas POW experience. His 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, documented the program's scope and significance. Kramer's research uncovered official records, personal correspondence, and camp newspapers that had been overlooked in previous historical accounts of World War II. Through extensive interviews with former prisoners and their American supervisors, he preserved first-hand testimonies that might otherwise have been lost to history. What emerges from these accounts, Kramer wrote, is not a simple narrative of captors and captives, but a complex human story that defies wartime stereotypes. The Texas POW camps became spaces where enemies encountered each other as individuals rather than as abstract threats. The resulting interactions, sometimes tense, sometimes surprisingly warm, reveal how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. The Texas POW program also left a lasting imprint on American military doctrine regarding the treatment of enemy prisoners. The generally successful management of German POWs informed U.S. policies during later conflicts, establishing principles that balanced security requirements with humane treatment. Military historians have identified the World War II POW program as a significant positive example in the evolution of American compliance with international humanitarian standards during wartime. Colonel Richard Howard, who served as a camp administrator at Camp Swift and later helped develop Army regulations for prisoner management, explained in a 1982 Military Journal article, "The Texas experience demonstrated that treating enemy prisoners with dignity, providing meaningful work, and allowing cultural expression not only complied with international law, but served pragmatic goals. Well-treated prisoners were more cooperative, created fewer security problems, and often returned home with a positive view of America that served our post-war interests." By the 1990s, as the World War II generation aged, efforts to preserve the physical and documentary evidence of the POW camps gained urgency. Archaeological investigations at former camp sites recovered artifacts ranging from mundane items like mess kits to elaborate crafts created by prisoners. Local museums established permanent exhibitions featuring photographs, letters, artwork, and oral histories. The Texas Historical Commission placed markers at former camp locations, ensuring that this chapter of history would not be entirely erased from the landscape. Camp Hearn Research Foundation, established in 1999, became particularly active in preservation efforts, working to stabilize remaining structures and create an interpretive center. Archaeological work at the site recovered thousands of artifacts that documented daily life in the camp, from handmade chess pieces to modified tools. The Foundation's Oral History Project recorded the memories of former guards, local residents who had interacted with prisoners, and even several former prisoners who returned to Texas specifically to share their recollections. One such returnee was Gustav Müller, who had been captured in North Africa in 1943 and spent 2 years at Camp Hearn. In a videotaped interview conducted in 2001, the 80-year-old Miller walked the grounds of the former camp, identifying locations with remarkable precision despite the passage of decades and the disappearance of most structures. "Here was where we built the theater," he noted, standing in an empty field. "And there we had a victory garden where we grew vegetables to supplement our rations, though the rations were already generous by wartime standards." Miller's most vivid memories concerned the relationships formed during captivity. "There was a guard, Sergeant Thompson, who discovered I had been a university student before the war. He brought me books in German that he had somehow found. Later, when I expressed interest in American literature, he loaned me his personal copies of Hemingway and Steinbeck. After the war, we corresponded for 20 years. I named my son Thomas after him." Such personal connections exemplified the unexpected legacy of the Texas POW program. What had begun as a pragmatic wartime measure, housing enemy prisoners far from the European front, evolved into a complex human exchange that influenced post-war reconciliation. The men who passed through the barbed wire gates of Texas camps carried those experiences back to Germany, where they often became advocates for democratic values and improved German-American relations during the critical early Cold War period. As the 21st century dawned, the number of living participants in the Texas POW saga dwindled rapidly. Historical interest, however, continued to grow as scholars recognized the program's relevance to contemporary issues of international humanitarian law, cultural diplomacy, and post-conflict reconciliation. The Texas experience offered a case study in how enemies might become allies through humane treatment and cultural engagement, lessons with potential application to modern conflicts. Dr. Lisa Meyer, a political scientist specializing in conflict resolution, observed in a 2005 analysis, "The Texas POW program succeeded in part because it balanced security concerns with recognition of prisoners' humanity by allowing cultural expression, educational advancement, and meaningful work." American authorities created conditions where mutual understanding could develop despite the context of global war. These elements, dignity, purpose, and cultural respect, remain essential components of successful post-conflict transitions today. The educational significance of the POW story gained recognition as Texas schools incorporated this local history into their curricula. By connecting global events to specific locations within their communities, educators found that students engaged more deeply with World War II history. The human dimension of the POW experience, told through individual stories rather than abstract statistics, resonated with young people trying to comprehend the war's immense scope and impact. Heather Rodriguez, a high school history teacher in Hearn, developed a program where students conducted research at the former campsite and created documentary projects based on primary sources. When students discover that world-changing events happened in their own hometown, history becomes immediate and relevant, she explained. The POW story challenges them to think about complex questions. How do we treat enemies during wartime? How do ordinary people respond when caught in global conflicts? Can meaningful human connections form across the divisions of war? For the communities that once hosted POW camps, this history became an element of local identity and occasionally a tourism draw. Annual events commemorating the camps attracted history enthusiasts, World War II veterans, and descendants of both prisoners and guards. The economic impact of such heritage tourism, while modest compared to major historical sites, provided rural Texas communities with a connection to global history that distinguished them from surrounding areas. Mayor James Wilson of Hearn, speaking at the opening of an expanded museum exhibit in 2010, noted, What happened here during the war years might seem like a footnote in the grand narrative of World War II. Yet for our community, it represents a moment when global forces brought the world to our doorstep. The connections formed during those years between Germans and Texans, between enemies who discovered their common humanity, are part of our town's legacy. The children and grandchildren of former prisoners sometimes develop their own connections to Texas through family stories. Hans Weber, whose father had been held at Camp Swift, visited Texas in 2015 to see where his father had spent 3 years during the war. Growing up, my father spoke of Texas more often than his combat experiences, Weber recalled. He described the landscape, the people, even the particular quality of light in the summer evenings. These stories gave me a strange familiarity with a place I had never seen, almost as if Texas were part of my own heritage. Some descendants discovered tangible links to this history through artifacts preserved by their families, artwork created in the camps, wood carvings, paintings, handcrafted furniture, had often been gifted to guards or local employers before repatriation. Other items had been carefully transported back to Germany as mementos of captivity. These objects, passing through generations, carried the physical imprint of this historical encounter between enemies who sometimes became friends. Monica Schneider, whose grandfather had been a prisoner at Camp Hearn, inherited a detailed wooden model of the camp that he had crafted after returning to Germany. He built this from memory in 1950, showing every building, the guard towers, even the theater and soccer field, she explained, while displaying the model at a 2018 historical symposium in Texas. When I was a child, he would use this model to tell stories about his time here. It was only as an adult that I realized how unusual it was for someone to create such a detailed remembrance of their prison. By the 2020s, as the last living participants in the POW program passed away, the preservation of their stories became entirely dependent on archives, museums, and family memories. Digital history projects work to make documents, photographs, and recorded interviews accessible to researchers and the public. Archaeological investigations continued at former camp sites, recovering physical evidence of this historical chapter that complemented the documentary record. The German POW experience in Texas has continued to attract scholarly attention because it represents an unusual case study in enemy treatment during total war. Unlike many historical instances where prisoners faced brutal conditions or exploitation, the Texas camps generally maintained standards that exceeded international requirements. This approach yielded unexpected diplomatic benefits in the post-war period as former prisoners returned to Germany with first-hand knowledge of American society that contradicted Nazi propaganda. Ambassador Richard Muller, who served as West Germany's diplomatic representative to the United States in the 1970s, had spent 2 years as a prisoner at Camp Swift. In his 1985 memoir, he wrote, "My understanding of America began behind barbed wire in Texas. There I saw a society different from what our propaganda had described, one of abundance rather than decadence, of pragmatic problem-solving rather than chaos, of religious freedom rather than godlessness." These observations shaped my later diplomatic career, particularly my efforts to strengthen German-American partnership during the Cold War. The Texas POW story also illuminates the complex psychological experience of captivity during wartime. For many German prisoners, the material conditions in Texas camps were superior to what they had experienced on the front lines or what civilians faced in war-ravaged Germany. This relative comfort sometimes produced guilt, particularly as news arrived of bombing devastation and civilian hardships at home. Psychological studies of returned prisoners in the 1950s documented this phenomenon, which some therapists termed survivor's guilt, a concept that would later be applied to various trauma contexts. For the American guards and administrators who managed the camps, the assignment presented moral complexities that many had not anticipated. Trained to view Germans as the enemy, they were tasked with ensuring humane treatment of prisoners while maintaining security. This balancing act required them to see prisoners simultaneously as potential threats and as human beings deserving of dignified treatment, a cognitive challenge that produced varying responses among personnel. Lieutenant Robert Williams, who served as a medical officer at Camp Hearn, reflected on this duality in a 1990 oral history interview. "I had joined the Army to fight Nazis, not to care for them. Yet there I was, treating men who had recently been shooting at American soldiers. Medical ethics required me to provide the same quality of care I would give our own troops. Over time, I came to see them as patients first and prisoners second. Some became almost like regular patients you'd get to know in civilian practice. It was a strange transformation that I couldn't have imagined during basic training." The creative and intellectual life that flourished in Texas POW camps demonstrated how human ingenuity persists even in confinement. The orchestras, theaters, educational programs, and artworks produced by prisoners represented a form of resistance against the dehumanizing potential of captivity. By maintaining cultural practices and intellectual engagement, prisoners preserved a sense of identity and agency despite their circumstantial powerlessness. Dr. Thomas Albrecht, who studied music composition under a former Berlin Philharmonic musician while both were prisoners at Camp Hearn, later became a professor at the Munich Conservatory. In a 1988 interview, he explained, "In the camp orchestra, we transcended our status as prisoners. When performing Beethoven or Bach, we reconnected with our cultural heritage and briefly escaped our circumstances. The American authorities understood the psychological value of these activities, which is why they permitted and even encouraged them. This enlightened approach distinguished American captivity from the Soviet alternative, where cultural expression was severely restricted." The religious life in the camps similarly provided spiritual continuity and moral framework during a period of extreme disruption. Services conducted by imprisoned chaplains or visiting clergy offered familiar rituals that connected prisoners to their pre-war identities. Theological discussions and Bible study groups addressed profound questions of meaning that arose from the war experience. For some prisoners, religious practice provided a moral compass that helped them navigate the ethical compromises and pressures of camp life, particularly regarding interactions with Nazi loyalists among the prison population. Father Johannes Kramer, a Catholic priest who had served as a military chaplain before his capture, maintained a spiritual diary during his time at Camp Hearn. Excerpts published in a 1995 religious history journal revealed his efforts to minister to men struggling with faith questions amid wartime trauma. "Today I spoke with a young man who witnessed atrocities on the Eastern Front and now questions God's existence. Another soldier confessed participating in actions against civilians that haunt his conscience. In captivity, separated from the chaos of battle, many confront moral questions they suppressed during combat. My role is not to judge, but to guide them toward reconciliation with God, with themselves, and eventually with those they have harmed." The political dimensions of camp life reflected the divisions within German society that would shape post-war development. The spectrum from ardent Nazi believers to anti-fascist resistors existed within the microcosm of the camps, creating tensions and occasionally violence. American administrators initially struggled to understand these dynamics, but gradually developed more sophisticated approaches to managing political divisions among prisoners. By segregating confirmed Nazi Party members and creating separate compounds for prisoners with anti-Nazi or democratic leanings, camp authorities reduced intimidation and allowed for more effective re-education efforts. This approach presaged the denazification programs later implemented in occupied Germany, recognizing that not all German military personnel shared Nazi ideological commitments and that many could potentially contribute to democratic reconstruction. Anton Weber, who had been part of the German military resistance against Hitler before his capture in North Africa, found himself in a special compound for anti-Nazi prisoners at Camp McCain in Mississippi before transfer to a Texas facility. In post-war correspondence preserved in the Bundesarchiv, he described this experience. The Americans eventually recognized that some of us had opposed the regime even while serving in its military. Once identified as anti-Nazi, we received opportunities to assist with camp administration, translation, and later with re-education programs for other prisoners. This recognition was personally vindicating after years of maintaining a dangerous facade of loyalty to a government I despised. The labor program that placed prisoners on Texas farms and in food processing facilities created some of the most significant opportunities for cross-cultural understanding. Working alongside civilian employers, prisoners moved beyond abstract perceptions of the enemy to form judgments based on direct interaction. Similarly, Texas farmers and business owners who initially viewed German prisoners with suspicion often revised their opinions through daily cooperation on practical tasks. These work relationships occasionally evolved into genuine friendships that persisted long after the war. A collection of letters preserved at the Briscoe Center for American History documents decades of correspondence between former prisoners and their Texas employers. These letters trace the evolution from formal communication about work matters to personal exchanges about family news, shared memories, and eventually visits between Germany and Texas as post-war travel became possible. Richard Schulze, who worked on a citrus farm near Camp Kennedy, maintained contact with the farm owner's family until his death in 1997. Their correspondence, spanning more than 50 years, documented parallel life events, marriages, births of children and grandchildren, business developments, retirements. What had begun as a pragmatic wartime arrangement, prisoner labor addressing civilian workforce shortages, developed into a lifelong connection that transcended national boundaries and wartime enmity. The Texas POW experience holds particular relevance for understanding how former enemies can transition to peaceful cooperation, a process scholars of international relations term reconciliation. The individual relationships formed during captivity created networks of personal connection that operated beneath the level of official diplomacy, but contributed to the remarkably successful post-war partnership between Germany and the United States. Recent scholarship has situated the Texas POW story within the broader framework of transitional justice and post-conflict reconstruction. The treatment of German prisoners, particularly the emphasis on re-education rather than punishment, exemplified an approach that sought to transform former enemies into potential allies. This strategy proved highly effective in the German case, contributing to the development of a stable democracy aligned with Western values, an outcome that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian system established in East Germany under Soviet influence. Dr. Michael Reynolds, a specialist in conflict resolution at the University of Texas, observed in a 2020 analysis the Texas POW program offers a historical case study in how treating defeated enemies with respect can yield strategic advantages. By experiencing American abundance, democracy, and pluralism firsthand, thousands of German prisoners returned home as informal ambassadors for a different political and economic model than the one they had fought for. The soft power impact of these personal experiences arguably contributed more to Germany's post-war Western orientation than any formal diplomatic initiative. As the last physical traces of the POW camps gradually disappear from the Texas landscape, their legacy persists in multiple dimensions: in the economic impact of prisoner labor during crucial wartime shortages, in the cultural exchanges that challenge stereotypes on both sides, in the educational and vocational training that prepared prisoners for roles in Germany's reconstruction, and in the personal relationships that exemplified reconciliation at its most intimate level. The story of German prisoners who feared American captivity but found unexpected comfort in Texas camps illuminates the complex humanity that persists even amid global conflict. It demonstrates how official policies, adherence to the Geneva Convention, implementation of work programs, support for educational and cultural activities can create conditions where individual relationships transcend wartime divisions. And it reminds us that history occurs not just in dramatic battlefield moments, but in quiet daily interactions across lines of conflict, interactions that sometimes yield the most enduring forms of peace.